Okay, excellent. We will make a start. So welcome everyone to our COP30 discussion event on reimagining systems. My name's Ethne Childs and I'm Head of Communities and Partnerships here at the IES. And I'm going to be hosting the discussion today. So today's event is part of the IES's Road to COP30 online event series, which will bring together environmental professionals to discuss key themes on the climate agenda and priorities for action. COP30 this year is taking place in Belém, Brazil, from the 10th of November to the 21st of November. And ahead of the conference, the IES is holding 4 themed online discussion events. Following this one, there's going to be discussion events on operationalizing finance, adapting to 1.5 degrees, and delivering solutions. And details of all of these can be found on our website. And I'll also post some links in the chat once we get started on those. As I mentioned, the event today will be focused on reimagining systems. Climate action requires transformative change away from the systems of consumption and production that embed climate pressures. And this discussion event will consider the core social and economic systems that we need to reimagine as we work towards a world with thriving people, a healthy economy, and a flourishing environment. We are really delighted today to have 3 speakers joining us who will each present on a different topic related to this theme. And we will then have some time for questions before moving into an interactive discussion across the whole group, where we'll be looking to explore some key questions related to this theme. This event is designed to be participatory, so please do get stuck into the discussion after we've heard from our speakers. Before I go on to introduce our speakers, I did want to go over a few housekeeping points. So this is set up as a meeting today so that we can kind of interact as much as possible. But this means that whilst others are presenting and speaking, please do mute yourself to limit background noise. But feel free to have your cameras on. It's great to see people's faces here today, especially as we go into the kind of discussion part of the event. If you would like to feed into the discussion or ask a question, probably the easiest way of doing this is raising your virtual hand. And you can do this by clicking on the React button at the bottom of your screen and choosing Raise Your Hand. And I'll then be able to come to you in due course when we get to the questions and discussions part. I also wanted to flag that today's event is being recorded, as you would have seen, but this is only for note-taking purposes and the recording will not be shared anywhere. Before COP30, the outcomes of some of these discussions will be brought together in a position piece, which will be used to brief the IES delegate attending COP30. But all of those discussion points will be aggregated and not directly attributed to any individual. So that's all of the housekeeping stuff over for today. I'm going to stop sharing now. Just to kick off, I thought it would be good to start with a quick poll, just to have a little think about the topic for today and what might be some priorities for action. So bear with me a second and I will just get that up and running on your screen. So that should be popping up now. And this is just a short answer question to get you thinking a little bit about what priority actions there might be for reimagining systems. And I'm going to keep this open and we'll come back to it at the end of the presentations. So please do put your thoughts in there. And as you're doing that, I'm really pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Colin Church. Colin is the Chief Executive of the Institute of Materials, Minerals and Mining, the global network for the materials cycle. He is chair of the Green Alliance convened Circular Economy Task Force that aims to lead policy discussions with ambitious business thinking, and a member of the UK government's Circular Economy Task Force. He is also a trustee of ChemTrust and a board member of the Materials Processing Institute and the Federation of European Materials Societies. As I mentioned, there will be the chance to ask your questions to the panel, so please do put these in the chat box or raise your hand at the end, and I can then put these questions to the panelists directly. Colin, thank you so much for joining today. I'll hand over to you.
You've actually stolen my first slide, which is why me, but you've covered all of that. The one thing that you didn't mention is the Professional Bodies Climate Action Charter, which I'm also involved with. But really, I think I'm probably here in large part because of IOM3, and you've already introduced that to us. In terms of IOM3, just very, very quickly, we're a membership body, so it's not surprising that one of our objectives is to be the best that we can be. Our second one, though, is to support professionals in our areas to be champions of the transition to a low carbon, resilient and resource efficient society. And resilient and resource efficient is another way of talking about circular economy, and that is the topic that I have been asked to talk about. I suppose, first of all, I should sort of set the context by saying, well, what's wrong with the current society that we've got, the so-called linear economy, which is all about take, make, use, lose. And here are some of the issues that I think you can identify that come from the current approach to a more linear economy. And you can see in there quite a lot of references to things like biodiversity loss and very importantly, greenhouse gas emissions. And why is the way that our economy works so relevant to greenhouse gas emissions and therefore to the conversations in COP30? Well, because if you dig stuff up out of the ground, then you create emissions. And here's just some data from a few years ago now, but I think it's still a useful way of looking at things, which suggests that material extraction is probably responsible for about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions globally. Pretty large proportion of the, and that's just technical products. And then obviously using those materials is also a big cause of greenhouse gas emissions. And this is a nice chart from the World Resources Institute, which gives you a sense of that. But you can see lots of places there, from cement and agriculture and transport and manufacturing and construction, etc. So all of that is problematic. It's even more problematic when you realize that our consumption of these materials, or our production and consumption of these materials, is going up, tripled over the past 50 years or so. It's a big issue in greenhouse gas terms. So basically, if we're going to tackle our climate change issues, if we're going to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas that we emit, we must use less stuff, and we must do so more efficiently. And here's just a couple of examples of the sorts of things that people talk around on the left-hand side: life cycle emissions from cars with and without material efficiency strategies. On the right-hand side, some carbon savings you might get from tackling areas such as construction, vehicle manufacturing, food and drink, electronics, and clothing, for example. So how do you do all of this? What's the concept? What's the system that we're talking about in this particular context? Well, of course, it's a circular economy, a more circular economy. Lots of different definitions that you can use. I like talking about maintaining materials at the highest value for as long as possible, but other people use different terms. And this is the so-called butterfly diagram from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which divides us into two lobes, if you like: finite materials, or technical materials, as some might call them, and renewable materials, and tries to describe how a circular economy can operate there, and basically trying to keep things going for as long as possible. And you'll see on the right-hand side, the outermost cycle, the worst, the least good cycle, is of course recycling. And there are lots of things that you can do better than that. And that's, I think, one of the things to always bear in mind when it's a conversation about the circular economy. Recycling is only a small part of that. And yet, in most discourse nowadays, amongst the wider public at least, that's probably the only element that people are really thinking about in any extent. So what does this greater circularity lead to? I'll say a bit more about lower carbon dioxide emissions in a moment. There's a bunch of other benefits that come along with it as well: less waste, more jobs, more innovation, less material cost, and more nature. That carbon dioxide thing is obviously a key element here. And that really is about reducing the materials we use by just using fewer, by reusing products, and then by reusing materials, and wherever possible by regenerating. And all of that together is what will deliver. So what's the system issue here? What are we talking about in terms of reimagining a system? Well, we're really fundamentally reimagining the economy, aren't we? That's the big problem that we have, is that the entire economy is set up to operate in a linear way. And there are all sorts of barriers. One barrier, obviously, is just the technology to make all of this happen, whether it's recycling technology or the ability of somebody to undo their thing. I don't know about you. When I was growing up, my dad used to do quite a lot of things around his car. Now, the only two things I'm allowed to do with my car are change the windscreen wipers and top up the windscreen fluid. So the the ability for somebody to repair, to maintain technology is becoming more and more niche, if you like. Culture and knowledge, is there a culture of reuse, a culture of repair? And do people have the knowledge to be able to do that? Do the laws and regulations support it, or do they in fact stand in the way? One of my favorite examples in this space, very small one, but I think very relevant one. Up until a couple of decades ago, it was quite common to reuse structural members from buildings when you were demolishing the building. And that changed. And one of the big drivers was nothing to do with whether or not you should reuse materials, but instead a requirement for greater safety in terms of working at height, which is a good idea. But it meant that rather than effectively sending two people up ladders to pull down bits that could then be reused, it was much safer and much better just to wreck it with a wrecking ball. And then, of course, your structural pieces are broken or bent or whatever else and not usable. So that's an example of laws and regulations put in place for a good reason, creating a problem in terms of more circularity. And then markets and economics. Lots of people will be very familiar with the concept of externalities, this idea that many of the goods and services that we consume aren't really, their prices don't really reflect their true cost, because they don't reflect the damage to the environment or to indigenous peoples or whatever else it might be. And that is definitely part of the issue. But it's also the case that some of the market structures are really difficult to apply to a more circular approach. It's not to say that you can't, it's not to say that people aren't already doing it, but to have widespread adoption of more circularity is a bit of an issue. So just a bit of a sort of a prompt really to say we do need to be thinking about the entire economy. We do need to be moving towards a more circular economy. And this is a really important part of the systems reimagining that we need to do. I can't leave without plugging a forthcoming event from IOM3 called Materials, Minerals and Mining for People, Places and Planet, Birmingham, November. And one of the big themes that we'll be talking about there is, in fact, circular economy. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Colin. That was a really useful kind of insight into the importance of the circular economy for climate ambitions and also some of the barriers that it faces at the moment. That was perfect. And to all our attendees, if you do have a question for Colin, sorry, please do put this in the chat box and we can come to it at the end. With that, I will pass on to our next panelist. So next up, we will hear from Simon Spooner. Simon is an Associate Director at Atkins Realis. He has been elected Atkins Realis Fellow for Water Quality and Carbon, one of around 40 top technical experts in the company. And he's also a Fellow of the IES, Chair of the Foundation for Water Research, and an Honorary Professor of Nottingham University for both the UK and Ningbo campuses. Thanks so much, Simon. Over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ethne. And thank you, Colin. Really good talk there. What I want to talk to you has a lot of very similar themes with Colin's, but takes a very different sort of philosophical approach and looks at things in a different way with the hope of maybe finding some effective ways forward. So I will attempt to introduce the concepts about combustion transition and also how that can lead to different systems thinking approaches for climate action. So if this is working, yes. So I'm going to start off with talking a lot about fire and the biosphere. I mean, we live in a living system that has evolved, and it creates this incredible disequilibrium between the sort of atmosphere with oxygen and the ground with the carbon in it. And that's all done by life, by the living system. And that fire is actually a consequence of that living system. Or we think that fire is just an ordinary thing, happens everywhere, we use it every day. But actually, sort of cosmically in the universe, it's incredibly rare. As far as we know, it's only on planet Earth where there is living systems. Maybe it's elsewhere, but we have no evidence as yet, because you have to create that disequilibrium. That use of fire has largely, defined the evolution of humanity. And we have worked with fire, and you could almost say we've co-evolved with fire. and we have turned fire to different purposes in enclosed combustion, which doesn't happen outside of human systems. So we create quite different forms of combustion and fire than from nature, and again, as far as we know, from anywhere else in the universe. The paradox we now face is that our use of fire is consuming that disequilibrium and destabilizing the very biosphere that sustains us and actually sustains fire itself. But it's not just fire that comes from this living system, the whole biosphere system. Also, there's the fossil fuels that give us even more concentrated and powerful fire, and even most of the minerals which we use to build our built environment. So fossil fuels, they are basically a compression of times, millions of years of living things depositing reduced carbon into the earth, often in ways which cannot be repeated now, and putting the oxygen into the atmosphere. So that's sort of part of that process. But also a lot of the minerals which we rely on are also from living things. So the iron that we mine in the great iron deposits, that's from the Precambrian oxygenation, when life first oxygenated the ocean and the iron all precipitated out onto these sort of algal mats. So it was created by living things. Limestone that we use to make our concrete, that's the body of marine organisms. Also vital phosphates, trace elements, silicates, which we use to make our glass and our silicon chips. These are heavily biologically mediated processes which concentrated those. So our built environment is actually a sort of crystallized, structured output from ancient life. So we come down to, how does relate to what we're doing now? And as Colin was saying, we are in this linear consumptive energy sort of system. So we're acknowledging the biosphere gives us these fuels and energies and minerals and things, which we extract, digging it out of the earth. We convert it into another form, generally, make, as Colin put it. We consume that and then we chuck it on the tip. And that is our road to destruction. Whereas, it's assuming that we've got a finite system. But in fact, the biosphere, what it can produce and the services it can deliver are infinite, but we are turning it into something finite. And our climate crisis is a symptom of this linear system, consuming that very disequilibrium. So where can we go from here? We need to move from consuming this fossil inheritance to aligning our use with the present, working with what is there in the present, capturing the energy from the sun, which is available in many different forms, and also working with and embracing the biosphere to provide us with services. So a lot of it's, the conventional obvious stuff. We need to move towards electrification, using renewable or nuclear energy instead of fossil fuels. We need our circular economy and seeing, our infrastructure as being banks of material which we are constantly reusing. And of course, efficiency helps, but it's not the end goal. We have to change the fundamental way we do it. But we also need to focus on services. Think of what we get in terms of services, not the commodities which we consume. So, we're interested not so much in a car, but as in mobility, not in a gas boiler as having a warm home. And we have to look at how do we get that service without the consumption. And we need to stop equating prosperity with just more burning, more consumption. And instead, how do we thrive within our boundaries and find access to abundant services? Because it's all there for us to use. There is plenty of available services from the biosphere, from our systems. So in a simple way, we need to stop consuming the biosphere, then bypass it as far as possible for energy and products. So harvesting our energy from the sun, from the warmth in the earth, or from residual nuclear sources, whilst also embracing the biosphere for services, working with living systems to get things which we need. And that will also involve enhancing the biosphere at times. I mean, agriculture is taking natural systems and then restructuring them, putting energy in, putting effort there, and then getting more out of what we want, but maybe not always considering what the system needs. So that can be important, but you can overdo it with the enhancement, and there's always a negative side as well as a positive. So how do we make that transition? How do we come to this systems thinking, which is much the theme of this discussion? Because sustainable systems, they tend to need to be interlinked, and you can't get there with sort of isolated changes. You need to work towards a system. Getting there means focusing on the services aspect. It's the services which lead to our outcomes. The outcome that we want from a system is a nice, comfortable life, thriving communities, healthy working and healthy natural systems. The systems provide that by providing services, and we change the systems by interventions. And we need to think, more carefully about how we structure interventions to lead to better outcomes. Now, this means working our sort of built environment systems, working together with the natural systems through this to provide the services which give us the sort of outcomes which we want: sustainable development, healthy lives, and people engaged in that process. Now you can start to get clever and consultant and engineering and understand how those services are provided by different types of infrastructure, modeling that, building digital twins, developing your policies and approach. But there's also another aspect to all of this, which is often overlooked. In this whole process of sort of nature concentrating materials and energy, humans evolving in that, we're also sort of concentrating and structuring that matter into cities, into machines, and increasingly, that has created our brains, which seem to be the most powerful thinking machines, which give rise to consciousness. But consciousness may be distributed across a lot of other living systems, but that is evolving, and our way of structuring and building these systems, we're now extending that process and extending our own consciousness with digital AI systems. Now, they may not have consciousness themselves, but they allow us to do more things more quickly, more powerfully. So just as we've learned to use the power of fire to concentrate and to get more services, to get things we want, so we're now learning to have enhanced sort of consciousness tools which can give us greater insight and and build the world in a different way. And that still has far to evolve and change. So just to summarize, fire, gift of life, it's also pretty dangerous. Climate action, what we need to do is to change our relationship with fire, not see burning stuff as being a good thing, but to learn how not to do it, how to be wealthy without burning. That means evolving our systems, understanding circular flows, service outcomes, integrated infrastructure that can supply that. To understand that we are part of this living system that concentrates matter and energy, and we are also concentrating matter and consciousness as well, and the power of ideas and thought. And so, for COP30 going into that, it's not just about emissions cuts. We really need to rethink our approach to civilization and how we work with a living world, and quite what our relationship is with the systems that we've built. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but it's my take on a different way of looking at things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was brilliant, really insightful presentation and a lot of food for thought. And I think a lot of good kind of starting points for the wider discussion as we go into that. So thank you so much for that presentation. Once again, to all our attendees, any specific questions for Simon, please do put them in the chat. But we are going to have a big discussion about these things after our final presentation, which means I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Uchenna Onyezu, a chartered environmentalist, professional fellow of the Nigerian Environmental Society, environmental professional in training with Eco Canada, agroecologist and practicing farmer with over 25 years experience in environmental management, climate change adaptation and sustainable development. As a UN-funded project coordinator in Nigeria, he merges academic, consultancy and community leadership, contributing globally at major international forums. And Uchenna also sits on the IES's Climate Action Community Steering Group. Thank you so much, Uchenna, and over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon. My name is Dr. Uchenna Onyezu. I'm going to talk about reimaging systems for climate actions, the roadmap to COP30, and I'm going to share my experience mainly from my experiences attending different COPs, and also my experiences within my local community. Go ahead. Okay, it's a privilege to join this panel as we reflect on the road to COP30, which will be taking place in Berlin, Brazil. And I bring to this discussion my perspectives from two complementary worlds. First, the global policy arena, where I have represented the Institution of Environmental Sciences, UK, as an official observer at COP28 in Dubai and COP29 in Baku, and where I will again be present at COP30 in Brazil. On the other side, the practical realities of rural development in Nigeria, where I serve as state project coordinator of IFAD-funded Life ND program, managing a 10 million USD agricultural transformation initiative across Abia State. Go on. I hold a PhD in forest ecology and a master's in environmental management and toxicology. Like was mentioned earlier, I'm a chartered environmentalist and a fellow of the Nigerian Environmental Society. Beyond these academic and professional titles, I am a practicing farmer, a local farmer, and a community leader. In fact, I've been honored as SAG Ohangwa, which is King of Yams. So this grounding and background brings in perspective from the UN climate negotiation halls and meetings to yam fields at my local area. And bringing all this together shapes my conviction that climate action is not just an abstract, but it's about people, you and I, about food, livelihood, and survival. Go ahead. So why do we need to reimage systems, and why does it matter? Of course, climate change cannot be seen as a single factor problem. It's a systemic challenge. It has to do with environmental, economic, social, and cultural issues at once. It touches food, health, governance, and even our identities. At COP28 in Dubai, which took place 2 years ago, a breakthrough was made where they called to transit from fossil fuels, and it was seen to be historic but fragile as it lacked enforceable commitments. At COP29, the debate was centered on climate finance. Pledges were made, yet local communities remained cut off from meaningful access. Therefore, it brings us to why we should think that COP30 is very, very important. We must move beyond declaration to transforming the systems that lock us into unsustainable pathways. Next. I want to bring this a little bit home to us discussing my projects, Life ND projects, which is a livelihood improvement family enterprise for Niger Delta project. It is funded by International Fund for Agricultural Development. In this project in my state, Abia State, Nigeria, the project demonstrates how reimaging agriculture can also be seen as reimaging climate change. We had adopted some agroecological approaches and principles where we engage smallholder farmers, women, youth as co-planners and not passive recipients. We apply nature-based solutions such as agroforestry practices, regenerative practices, and we ensure that we restore degraded wetlands. We deploy selective land clearing practices, avoiding unnecessary deforestation and reducing carbon footprints. Next. We also ensure that we plan tree planting activities, which restores degraded lands and create green jobs. We ensure that we deploy eco-friendly enterprises, such as aquaculture, organic farming, and poultry agribusinesses that combine livelihoods with low emission practices. This model, over time, over the past 5 years we've been in practice, had proved that farmers are agents of climate solution and not just victims. Agriculture can be a partner in ecosystem restoration, not only a driver of degradation. So, lessons from my project, the Livelihood Improvement Family Enterprise for Niger Delta, which is funded by International Fund for Agricultural Development, hold relevance across the Global South and beyond. Next. Other systems that we think that needs to be reimaged, the energy and industrial sector. In Nigeria, for example, millions still live without reliable electricity. For the Global South, the big question for us here that are involved in this discussion is how do we expand energy assets without depending heavily on fossil fuel? For the Global North, the task remains how to radically decarbonize. Therefore, at COP30, the energy transition for discussion and for negotiation must be just, or must be seen to be just, equitable, and ensure job creation. In terms of finance and governance, for example, last year COP, which is COP29, finance-dominated discussion, but grassroots communities saw little change. Funds remain locked in bureaucratic systems, inaccessible to local actors. Therefore, reimaging finance means predictable, transparent, direct flows to farmers, local farmers, community farmers, youth investors, and local government systems. Next. In terms of culture and knowledge, I take exception to this because I'm also particularly involved in this. Too often, indigenous and local knowledge seem to be sidelined. My title, Ezeji Ohanwa, which is King of Yams, reminds me that cultural legitimacy matters a lot in sustainable development or in sustainability issues. Therefore, at COP30, I'm envisaging that I'm also proposing that traditional wisdom must stand alongside with science in shaping solutions that is sustainable. Next. I'm bringing us all together. The lesson I took from COP28 and COP29 remains this: words, and I mean words alone, do not shift systems. Implementation does. And implementation requires equity, trust, and accountability. Therefore, success to the road to COP30 will not be measured only by negotiating texts, which is what we are always used to, which is always what takes the center page, the center stage, but lived by realities. Whether a smallholder farmer in my state, in my local community, can actually engage in his or her agribusiness activities with confidence when there are little support from projects like mine, like the Livelihood Improvement Family Enterprise project and other similar projects that supports this local existence. Whether a worker in the UK system or any place in the global north can thrive in a fair and green economy. Whether an indigenous leader in the Amazon, Brazil, can see that their forests, their natural resources can be protected and their culture respected. Therefore, reimaging the system is all about reshaping how we live, produce, and coexist with nature. Therefore, thriving communities, resilient economies, and a flourishing environment are not just and will never be competing goals. Rather, they remain an interdependent bodies. Go on. In conclusion, as we head towards COP30, there are key reflections and questions we need to be asking ourselves and we need to think about. In terms of agriculture and food, of course, we know that agricultural activity involves a lot of emission. In fact, agriculture is seen as one of the highest in terms of carbon footprint within the sectors. And we need approaches like agroecology, and we also need to ensure that it is resilient. As a question, if smallholder farmers feed most of the world, why are they still marginal in terms of climate financing or in terms of discussing issues that has to do with climate financing? How do we put food systems at the center of climate action, at the center of our discussions going forward? In terms of energy, Global South needs access. Global North needs rapid cuts. What does a just transition mean in your context or in our context? Whether you're in Africa or you live in Africa, whether you're in Europe or you live in Europe or in Latin America, how do we make the transition fair for all? These are key discussions that we need to ask ourselves as we head to COP30. In terms of finance, and in most COPs, monies, resources are pledged. But the reality is that, because I can attest to that, because I live in a community, I live in a rural area, in a rural area of Global South. The truth of the matter is that these things do not actually reach the communities. So how do we ensure climate funds are direct, predictable, and accountable? In terms of culture and indigenous knowledge, and I say it anywhere, and we all know that local wisdom, local knowledge are always undervalued. So how do we ensure indigenous peoples are partners in shaping climate action, not just as observers? My experiences with the past COPs, with the past two COPs, you see that in most cases, key issues, key negotiations, the real people that are subject to climate shocks never come to the forefront to discuss how climate action can be shaped. They remain observers. In terms of justice and equity, there are promises, and of course, the reality remains a big gap. So how do we shift from the present as we move to COP30? How do we shift from COP30 pledges to genuine transformation that communities can actually feel? These are critical questions. These are critical reflections that we need to find answers to. And I look forward to your reflection, critiques, and contribution as we reimage pathways for climate actions together. Thank you for listening.
I just wanted to say a massive thank you to all of you for attending, participating, sharing your views and questions. Thank you especially to Colin, Simon and Uchenna for your really insightful presentations and kind of kicking off the discussion and answering all those questions. So thank you so much for engaging today. As I mentioned, everything we've discussed today will help to inform our work ahead of COP30. And as I mentioned, the outcomes of the discussions will be brought together in a position piece, which we'll use to brief the IS delegate, Uchenna, who will be attending COP30 this year. If you're interested in attending our upcoming events in the Road to COP30 series, you can do so by registering for these on our website. I've put a link in the chat about those, and they're also just on the website if you want to find them there. Then please do join us. It'd be great to have you at that discussion as well. And if you're interested in getting involved in the wider work of the IES related to climate action, then please do consider joining our climate action community. For now, that's it from us today. Thank you again to everyone for logging in and participating. I hope you found that useful. Have a great rest of your day. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.